All right, guys, what's going on? So today I wanted to make a video on a topic that is prevalent, specifically in either new female competitors or women who are looking to compete for the first time, but for all women who compete in general. So this is going to be the topic of amenorrhea, and amenorrhea is the loss or the absence of the menstrual cycle that occurs in women. So I think it's real important that we understand that there are two types of amenorrhea. What we consider medical amenorrhea, which is in which you would be classified as having amenorrhea by a physician, would not happen until you've missed at least 3 menstrual periods. But acute amenorrhea can obviously happen for 1 to 2 months, up until the 3 month period in which you would be what we consider medically classified as amenorrhea. So this is something that is very, very common in female physique competitors for a couple of reasons we'll get into. What I'm going to do in this video is I'm going to talk about what causes amenorrhea, what are the consequences of amenorrhea, and then how we can kind of fix those consequences and going about with a cure. So we'll say that's a pretty loose term, the word cure, but kind of how we can go about fixing the problems that amenorrhea causes. So the first things first is what causes amenorrhea? What causes a woman to lose her menstrual cycle? Specifically looking at this from the angle of a female physique competitor. Now, obviously, there's exercise-induced amenorrhea, which we can kind of get into a little bit, maybe on a different video. But this is more for traditional athletes like track and field, volleyball, whatever. But specifically, I'm talking about physique sports here in females. So what causes amenorrhea? One of the things that definitely causes amenorrhea are low levels of body fat. So everybody has what is referred to as their body fat set point, and that is a certain percentage of body fat in which your body is very comfortable at operating, that's at the very bottom line. Once we go below our body fat's set point, for women, it can become increasingly difficult to maintain the menstrual cycle once we cross that body fat set point. Once we cross that body fat set point, our body kind of starts to freak out a little bit. Our metabolism alters and potentially slows down. We kind of change some metabolic processes within the body. And pretty much all processes that the body does not deem as necessary for survival, they either slow down or they completely shut off. And so to prioritize surviving, obviously, over everything else. For women, that is where the menstrual cycle either slows down or stops completely. In men, that's kind of when we see some temporary hypogonadism, where your testosterone tends to drop a little bit, because obviously the reproductive system is not something that is completely necessary for survival. So in a situation where you're below your body's body fat set point and it's kind of freaking out and it's trying to figure out what it needs to prioritize, it will tend to obviously decrease things that are not necessary, which the reproductive system isn't necessary. So now that body fat set point is completely different for everybody, both men and women. Obviously, we're talking about females here, but that body fat set point is completely different for everybody. It's not something that is at this certain body fat percentage, women lose their menstrual cycle. It isn't that clear cut. It's very individual dependent. So like I said, it's hard to put a specific percentage on it, as in once you get here, you lose it. So some are higher than others depending on the individual. I have heard of women who have gone through entire contest preps and they've never lost their menstrual cycle. And I've heard of women who have lost their menstrual cycle 10 weeks out. And so obviously that in its own can show some differences in the dieting techniques, yes, but more so less, like that body fat set point is different for everybody. So what's another thing that causes amenorrhea? And that's going to be our low caloric intake. Inevitably, when we're eating low, insufficient calories to fuel our body, there's going to be some nutritional deficiency that gets created through that. We're either not going to be consuming enough of this or consuming enough of that in order to help keep the body optimally performing its best, we'll say. Obviously, over time, this places a lot of stress on your body, and inevitably, over time, it can alter the hormonal panel of your body in a negative sense. So whether that's with women, it alters specifically. We're looking at the testosterone to estrogen ratio, kind of throws it off out of whack. We see the same thing in men. Obviously, the body prioritizes survival over menstruation here during this time of low caloric intake. So it will shut down the menstrual cycle in order to help keep the body surviving. What's something that is kind of hypothesized? I've heard a lot of people talk about whether this is true or not, but what is kind of being referred to as the energy reserve equation. So just to kind of put into perspective as to how this would kind of work, let's say that for a female, her energy reserve, the maximum capacity that this has would be a 500 calorie deficit. Okay, so what this means is that at a 500 calorie deficit, everything works optimally. Once we start to go beyond that 500 calorie deficit, we start to see some negative hormonal changes, and we start to see some metabolic changes being made. And so kind of what this equation basically says is if we've got an energy reserve of 500 calories or negative 500 calories, and say we have a female who is, over the course of her day, she's burning 2,000 calories and she's only consuming 1,500. Obviously, that's a caloric deficit of 500 calories. We can do that math there. 500 calories, because her energy reserve is 500 calories, everything is still working optimally within that energy reserve. So let's say we have that same woman who's burning 2,000 calories, but she's only eating 1,300 calories. So now she's in a caloric deficit of 700 calories. Her total net caloric deficit is exceeding that of her energy reserve, which again is 500. So once we start to get into that type of scenario, that's when we start to see some negative hormonal changes, and we start to see some metabolic changes taking place over women. Generally, the longer that we're in that period, that's when we start to see the menstrual cycle slow down. And that's something that I will get into later, but I do believe that that's kind of inevitable. We start to see that over time, this can kind of create some disorders in the hypothalamus and create potentially an estrogen deficiency. So we'll start to see suppressed levels of luteinizing hormone and gonadotrophic releasing hormone in women, which obviously is a huge contributor to the loss of the menstrual cycle. Training intensity can cause amenorrhea. Varying volumes and training intensities, more volume, more intensity, etc., can alter the ratios of cortisol and testosterone in the body of a female, which is going to throw off her estrogen ratio, which will eventually throw off the menstrual cycle. Combining all of this with a low caloric intake and low levels of body fat, and you can start to see how over a significant period of time, this is extremely stressful on your body, and which your body would be very likely to shut down its reproductive system. And finally, one of the major causes of amenorrhea in female physique competitors would be certain drugs that are used. Specifically, we're kind of looking at Anavar and nandrolone in here. Anavar specifically can kind of interfere with the estrogen and progesterone cycle that's in women, so it can throw off the menstrual cycle, if not completely eliminate it. We can also see that having potential thyroid disorders can cause amenorrhea, whether the thyroid is overactive or underactive, which is something that it seems in a contest prep that you're in one of those two scenarios more often than not. Either your thyroid is underactive in the situation where you would not be using synthetic T3 and or T4. And if you are using synthetic T3 and or T4, you probably have an overactive thyroid. Being on either end of that spectrum, being underactive or overactive in your thyroid, can definitely help contribute to amenorrhea, and it definitely does not help the cause. So now that we kind of understand some of the things that can cause amenorrhea, specifically looking at that from the angle of a female physique competitor, let's talk about what some of the consequences are by being in a state of amenorrhea. There are two main ones that are the main subject of focus when we look at amenorrhea, specifically an exercise-induced amenorrhea. Number one, we're looking at infertility. When a woman is not on her menstrual cycle, she can obviously not conceive children, and so she cannot become pregnant. And then the second major risk is osteoporosis. So having a low estrogen for a long period of time can decrease the bone density and weaken the bones within your body. This is something that is obviously harmful on its own, but I think this problem is amplified in female physique competitors because something that is very common is that females and males in general too, when you're looking at like a pre-contest diet, you very rarely see dairy. So if you don't have a direct dairy source, you don't necessarily have a direct calcium source. So you're putting a female in a position where her bone density and mineral density is decreasing, and you're not giving her calcium in order to kind of combat that. So you're kind of really speeding up that process by eliminating dairy. Obviously, the longer that we're in a state of weakened bone density can potentially lead to osteoporosis, which is obviously a very big problem. Not something that anyone would want to live with. I can assume. So that those are the two main problems, and obviously the infertility problem may not be a problem in the moment. But I do believe that the osteoporosis and the weakening of the bone density is something that is definitely a big problem in the moment. And again, because of the nature of bodybuilding diets, there's really not something that can help combat that. Now, we're starting to see that the risks in the severity and the what I will call irreversibility of these two problems, they linearly correlate with the time that you're spent in a state of amenorrhea. So what does that mean? The longer that we're without the menstrual cycle, the worse that the infertility gets, and the worse that the potential risk of osteoporosis is. Now, we have some good evidence to suggest that there may be a period of time in which these two things are irreversible. So if a woman is without her menstrual cycle for a significant amount of time, she may never be able to become pregnant again because she has spent so much time in an estrogen deficiency that she can no longer become fertile. And we can also see up to the point where the osteoporosis becomes so severe that it is not reversible. So those are things to consider, that the longer that we're in a state of amenorrhea, the more severe that these two things can become, and they can potentially become irreversible. So that's something that needs to be absolutely kept in mind as we go forward with a contest prep. So now let's talk about the cure and how are we going to go about fixing all these problems with amenorrhea. And the number one answer and the most obvious answer is gaining weight and gaining body fat and increasing your caloric intake post-show. Now, I'm not talking where you eat so much food and you put on so much weight and you put on so much body fat that you actually become unhealthy from becoming overweight and obese. But it's enough. I'm talking about enough calories and enough weight and enough body fat to get you healthy and get you out of the hole that you've dug yourself in contest prep, because that's something that's inevitable. When we're dieting that hard and getting to supremely low levels of body fat for a show, we have dug ourselves into a hole. And depending on how lean we've gotten and how long we've been dieting, that hole can be pretty deep. So we need to get out of that hole as fast as possible. Now, this is something that is much easier said than done, specifically with women. From my experience, is that women post-show have a harder time putting on weight and putting on body fat than men do. But I obviously see this problem with men. You become so mentally attached and focused to the physique that you've created for your show date that you don't want to get rid of that, and you don't want to put body fat on, and you don't want to see all your lines and detail blur and disappear and all of those things. But that is exactly what you need to be doing post-show. I think it's really important that both men and women understand the concept that being that lean for an extended period of time is unbelievably unhealthy and can cause a lot of health issues if it's drug out too long. So what we're really trying to focus on with the show is peak for that show date and then get back into a healthy state so that we can make progress in the off season so that we can be even better for our next showing than we were this year. And that is something that is very mentally difficult for people to do, like especially in a contest prep. It's not physically hard for people to eat after their show. They're starving, their body's screaming at them to eat. So it's not physically hard to eat more food and put more weight on post-show, but that's something that mentally is a huge roadblock for a lot of people, women specifically, that they need to try and overcome. And then obviously the quicker that they can overcome that problem, the faster they can get their menstrual cycle back, and the faster that they can try to get things back on track in terms of a health focus. Now, if the problems have been drug out too long and you have reached that point where things are irreversible, you may need to look at estrogen replacement therapy if you're a woman, if you're a woman, which is obviously just the female version of testosterone replacement therapy. You are synthetically injecting your estrogen to kind of help balance out the ratio of your estrogen to testosterone, which will hopefully eventually re-stimulate your body to have the menstrual cycle again. So that is kind of worst case scenario, that a woman goes on estrogen replacement therapy, but it is not necessarily uncommon, especially if this is drug out for a very long time. So now that we've kind of talked about all of those things, let's talk about the ideal scenario in handling amenorrhea and handling all of its complications within a contest prep. So obviously the ideal scenario would be that we go the duration of the contest prep without having to deal with amenorrhea. That would be the ideal scenario. Unfortunately, I don't think that that's the most practical scenario because of all the things that we talked about earlier, all the things that cause amenorrhea: high training volumes with high training intensities, low caloric intake, low levels of body fat, certain drugs. All of those things, with the exception of the drugs, if you compete in a drug-tested federation, all of those things are pretty much given for contest prep. So if you've got all of the things that can potentially cause amenorrhea coming at you all at one time, I do think that inevitably amenorrhea will occur during the case of a contest prep, or if it's not a contest prep, just a really aggressive diet. So because I think it's so inevitable and it's so hard to avoid, I don't think that the ideal scenario anymore is no longer that it never happens. I think the ideal scenario is that we limit the length of the amenorrhea, and then as soon as the show is over, we very quickly reverse out of that amenorrhea. I believe that is the ideal scenario. So the ideal scenario would be as late as possible into the contest prep is when the amenorrhea sets in, and then as soon as possible after the show, we can get the menstrual cycle back functioning fully and properly within the woman. And that may be something that can depend on the length of your diet, the severity of the diet. This may be something that we see linearly correlates with the length of your diet. So like I was saying, if women who tend to do longer contest preps, maybe we'll start to see as the years go on, women that do longer contest preps, they have less problems with amenorrhea. Or maybe we'll see that women in longer contest preps, they have more problems with amenorrhea because they're in a caloric deficit for a longer period of time. That's something that you kind of have to gather data on as a coach, and something that we'll see, and that I will see as we go on and we see these kinds of things. It could be the severity of the deficit. Are you in a very, very harsh deficit? Are you just in kind of like a mild deficit where you're losing 1 pound-ish a week? That may be something that is person dependent. Some women may be better with longer, less aggressive contest preps, or versus some may be better with shorter, more aggressive. That's something that's personal preference, and that's kind of your job as a coach or as an individual to determine for yourself. But yeah, all right. So hopefully you guys like that. If you guys liked it, drop a like on the video. See you guys later.